All right, welcome back. Today we're going to shiplap this fireplace. So my wife loves shiplap, so we're starting projects throughout the house, and this is the first one. Eventually, I'm going to build a big cabinet right here, so I definitely want to get the shiplap in before that. So anyway, let's see how it comes out. Let's get after it. First, I'm just trimming this paneling plywood down to a little bit more manageable length. And then after setting my fence at 5.5 inches, I added a little bit of extra support beyond the fence to help me with a little bit straighter cut. And really it's just a 2x4 with a straight edge, and I just screwed it down to my workbench. I am marking it because when I move my fence, I want to be able to reset this back and have a perfect 5.5 inch measurement. One of the things that I learned from the last time doing shiplap is once you get it on the wall, it's really difficult to paint these edges. So I stacked them up and I'm painting them in advance, which is going to speed up time later on. And if you're wondering what type of wood this is, it's paneling plywood. It was about $21 a sheet versus roughly $60+ a sheet for other types of 1/4 inch plywood. But it is not as durable, so you will need a good finishing blade and cut really slow. So I wanted to save time and not have to paint the whole wall white just to see the little strips behind the plywood. So I had an idea to paint these lines. Don't ask me how I missed that one. And at the time it seemed like a good idea, but in hindsight, it probably took just as long to do that plus paint the wall. Either way, you just want to make sure you get whatever paint color your shiplap is going to be behind the wall. Spend a little bit of time to get your corner just right. It doesn't matter if it's perfect with the trim, it just matters if it's level. Because after your spacing, this will be how the rest of your wall lays out. But this particular corner was giving me a little problems. Wasn't fitting perfect, so I had to remove a little bit on the right side by the wall. So here I am just taking a little bit off of that corner for the angles that I marked. And once I got it on just right, I use these tile spacers, which are 1/8 of an inch. You can use any spacing you want, but 1/8 of an inch is what I like. And then just repeat the same steps for the other side. And once I get this in place, I do end up marking the wall to find my studs, which I did on the other side. I just forgot to record that. Another issue you'll likely run into doing corners of sheetrock is the mud is never going to be even on these corners. So if your boards are not lining up perfect, you can just shave the corners off with a razor. You won't see that anyway behind the shiplap. And while I repeat these steps, I will show you later in the video how I get these 45-degree cuts to line up perfectly. And just remember, when working around these live power outlets, getting your measurements right and messing with them with a screwdriver, it is best to kill the power to them. I didn't do that in this instance, but definitely best practice. And the way I like to measure my power outlets is put the board right where it's going to be and make sure you mark on the outside of the plastic, or else it will hit your wood and bow it out a little bit. So once I get my measurement, I just add 1/8 of an inch for the spacer, mark my lines, and then cut it out with a simple jigsaw. And you will have a little bit of wiggle room on these measurements around these outlets because the face plate will add about 1/4 of an inch on each side, maybe even a little more of wiggle room. And if you're enjoying what you see so far, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe. I do have a lot more videos I want to put out, and I'd love for you to follow along and give me feedback along the way. So now let's tackle these wonderful corners. I used this corner measuring guide on my first attempt, which did not go very well. So, I marked it and then I measured from each side where I thought it should land and cut it out with my jigsaw. So far, so good. But now for the moment of truth, and not even close. I'm not really sure how it got so far off. I know those measuring tools do actually work really well, but apparently I was not able to use it successfully. So I just went with the old paper measuring trick, and it worked much better. And I'll show you that trick here in a second on the top of the mantle.
Okay, so let me show you this paper trick that I'm talking about. I really just put the paper up and maneuver it around. It's very pliable. And get it till it fits perfect by cutting it with scissors. And that's what I use to mark my scribe. And once I'm starting to get the fit how I want it, then I just move it over to the paper and trace it out. Make my finishing touches and get it just how I want. And then I am going to measure across the bottom. It's about, I think I remember it being about 1 inch, something like that. And just marked my 1 inch all the way across until the other side of the mantle. So this is a good time for me to show you how I'm cutting these corners, these 45-degree angles on the edges. So for me, the trick was just going super slow, moving it very, very, very ever so slightly until I just sneak up on the cut. And then once I do sneak up on the cut, I go really slow with my blade. I've actually got this sped up pretty fast. So I was going very slow cutting through that piece. And then I'll just cut it out with my jigsaw. Going slow. The video is sped up quite a bit, so I am going pretty slow just to make sure I get it right. And on the end, you'll notice that I just cut a square off. It's because the mantle was not flush to the wall, and it's pretty bad, so I was able to just go behind it. You could see it right there. And then the piece under it just went right under that, so close that gap a little bit. That was helpful. So then I'll just get it glued up, tacked in place, and it fits well, and caulk will cover all this pretty nicely later. Then I'll just speed this next part up quite a bit because this is all repetitive. So I do go all the way up the wall on each side to make it easier to connect perfectly to each corner on the 45s for the longer ones. And then I made it about as far as I could go without pulling the TV down, which was helpful because this is not my primary job. So I get to do this in the evenings and on the weekends, and we use the downstairs basement a lot. So left the TV up until the very last minute. And then here I'm just repeating the steps from earlier, marking my outlet, making my cuts. I did leave this little square in here so the piece would have something to catch on. So the actual outlet sits on top of the wood so that when you put on the faceplate, the outlet itself is not sunken in a little bit. And now coming up on this next part, I measured these holes from the end of the wall and the mantle to make sure I was able to hit these perfectly so I didn't have to re-drill holes into different parts of the stud to be able to put the TV brace back on. And that's my gibberish. That makes sense to me, but probably nobody else. And then just repeat the steps, finish the wall, and knock out these harder pieces where we'll do some scribing that we'll get into right now. And I decided to scribe because the ceiling is not really straight, so I didn't want a really big caulk line. So I just used a marker and traced the line against the ceiling on an old piece of scrap.
All right, so once I scribed it, I cut it out. You saw that piece already. And then I measured basically from the ceiling to the bottom of that first, that last piece of shiplap, minus 1/8 of an inch for the gap. And that came out to 5 3/16 on that side and 5 1/16 on that side. So measured from the bottom, it'll give me that eighth of an inch gap. And then now that I scribed this, I will just basically put that corner right there and then that corner right there, and that is what I'm going to cut off, and that should be perfect to the ceiling. So see how it goes.
And sorry about not showing that left corner, but I think you get the point, which is basically just to use a scrap piece to mark your good piece, and you cut that out, and I sand it a little bit just to knock off the rough edges.
Okay, you can see that came out just about perfect. That'll be good for caulking. It is a little long. That's okay, I'm just gonna trim a little back off. Actually, the reason it's long, you can see it's hitting in that corner. So all I'm gonna do is just round out that corner a little bit, but you can see the scribe is dang near perfect for caulking, and I got my 1/8 of an inch gap. So that's how you scribe. Yeah, so you can see once I notched out that corner, fits perfect. And perfect 1/8 of an inch gap.
And remember that step from earlier where I marked all the holes. Now I'm going back and marking them again so I can drill these just with little bitty pilot holes, so when I put my screws back for the TV brace, it'll go right back into the stud where it was before. Okay, so I want to spend a little time on these corners. As you can see, the cuts came out really straight. Again, that's from a nice finishing blade and going very slow, but they're pretty sharp, and I want to fill in those little gaps. So a good way to do that is just to round them off with the edge of a screwdriver or anything that would resemble this. So you don't want to do it really hard. This is a very light pass. You can see I'm just basically bending the wood a little bit. And then once I have it rounded over, I will still fill in any gaps with some wood filler. I basically just rub this in every corner regardless of how well it came together with the screwdriver. And I pulled in a picture from later on when it's finished to show you how well these corners end up coming out. So then just quickly fill in all the holes for the whole thing.
And I wanted to show something real quick. I know earlier you're probably wondering why I put glue behind there. Well, because this is just little brad nails. And I was actually, I mean, it was pretty obvious, but I was putting brad nails into the sheetrock, which is not going to hold it. But really the only intent there was to press it up against the wall so the glue could take over. So now you could see that there's no pressing anymore in the corners where there were before. It would slightly press against the wall, or come out a little bit. So, once that glue, and it doesn't have to be perfect, just, glue to kind of hold it to the wall pretty good. There are brad nails in each of the studs, so that's going to hold it as well. But that's why I was putting that glue, because it makes it pretty sturdy. So.
Now we're just going to go ahead and caulk the whole thing. I'm not going to do a bunch of explanation on this. There's plenty of videos out there. Plus, I'm not a big fan of caulking, and nor do I think I'm great at it. But I've learned enough along the way to make it look okay and clean it up. And now it's ready to prime. But I'm going to skip that part because it's pretty boring and move on to sanding. So I did end up sanding this with 320 grit just to smooth it over. And fortunately, I do have a dust extractor, which helps big time. But if you don't have one, you're still going to need to sand and probably just do a lot of cleanup. And on the edges, I just take a little piece of sandpaper and roll them over ever so slightly. And finally, it's time to paint. I'm using a large roller here because I'm using a pretty good paint quality. So it'll smooth itself out and remove most of the little roller bumps. You can also paint this with a brush, but I think this is a little bit faster. And then once we've rolled a couple coats on it, let's just go ahead and cut in around the edges and on the wall and the ceiling and finish this up. So this is the paint that I was talking about. I think it's a little above the middle of their quality of paints, but as you can see, when you roll it, eventually when it dries, it smooths out really well. And then once it's all painted and dried, make sure it's dried well because you don't want this tape pulling the paint off of the shiplap. Now I can just paint the wall where I hit it during my cut-in process and make it really nice. And that's it. Let's go ahead and see the finished product. So this is a project that I enjoyed. It was a bit difficult with those corners and that paneling plywood, but it was worth it because that paneling plywood is significantly cheaper, and it still comes out really well if you take your time and pay attention to detail. So thanks for following along. I appreciate it. And again, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe. And stay tuned for my next video on this farmhouse table build.